The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a supply invoice and a note from the outfitter in town, and Faye recognized the handwriting before she'd even finished drawing it from the stack. Conrad's penmanship was always too precise, controlled like everything else about him. I know you're in Wyoming. Come home before this becomes something neither of us wants. She read it twice, then she set it on the workbench, smoothed it flat with her palm, and went back to the shirt collar she'd been turning. Her hands were steadier than she expected. Steadier, at least, than they'd been 2 years ago, the morning she'd walked out of Conrad Price's house in Denver with a traveling bag and her mother's sewing box and nothing else that was truly hers. She'd run far enough. She was done running. If you'd been standing in that Wyoming sewing room, if you'd watched a woman press her palm over a threatening letter and pick up her needle like the letter was simply another thing to be gotten through, you'd have known something about who Faye Drummond was. Not who she'd been made into, who she actually was. Before we go any further, if stories like this one mean something to you, subscribe to this channel and follow Faye's story all the way through. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments what city or state you're watching from. Now, let's go back to where this started. The train pulled into Dorsey, Wyoming on a gray morning in October that smelled like pine resin and coming snow. Faye stepped onto the platform carrying one traveling bag and her mother's sewing box, which she'd wrapped in an old wool shawl and wedged between 2 dresses so it wouldn't shift during the 4-day journey from Denver. The box was made of cherry wood, 12 inches long, with a tray of compartments inside that still held the smell of her mother's lavender sachets even after 6 years. It had survived 3 moves, 1 fire, and 2 years inside a house where Conrad had rearranged everything that belonged to her, a slow, patient rearranging that was designed to remind her that nothing in his house was actually hers. The sewing box was the one thing she'd kept out of his reach. He hadn't known it existed. He'd considered sewing beneath comment, which was why she'd been able to hide it behind the pantry shelving for 2 years. Why she'd been able to carry it out the door on the morning she left without him noticing it was gone. That's what he missed, she thought, stepping into the Dorsey wind. He was so busy watching the big things he missed what I was keeping. A man leaning against the depot wall straightened when he saw her. He was broad through the chest, somewhere in his 50s, with a weathered face and the particular expression of a man who'd been sent to collect something and was already privately revising his expectations. Miss Drummond? That's me. He looked at her traveling bag, then at the sewing box wrapped in its shawl. His expression did not change, but she felt the calculation behind it, the same quiet arithmetic that men always ran when they looked at her. Too soft for this. Too much of her in all the wrong ways. Won't last the season. Dutch alderman, he said. I run the crews for Mr. Hale, wagons out front. He didn't offer to carry the box. She carried it herself. The ride to the Hale timber operation took 40 minutes through country that was beautiful in the specific, indifferent way of places that don't notice whether you admire them or not. Ponderosa pine, rimrock, a river, the color of pewter running through the valley below. Dutch said perhaps 12 words the entire way. Faye counted, because she had nothing else to do. She'd come to Dorsey because of a notice pinned to a board at the Denver employment office. Seamstress wanted, mending and general sewing for lumber operation, room and wages, Wyoming. It had been the word Wyoming that decided her. Far enough from Denver that Conrad would have to make a deliberate effort. Far enough from his connections, his lawyers, his banker friends who all thought he was a gentleman because he dressed like one and spoke softly enough that his control could be mistaken for consideration. She hadn't told anyone where she was going. She'd sent a letter to her sister in Ohio with a forwarding address and instructions to share it with no one, which her sister had agreed to immediately, because her sister had met Conrad once and understood what the letter meant, without Faye having to say it directly. The timber operation came into view the way frontier properties do, first as smoke rising above the tree line, then as the sound of saws, then as the whole organized sprawl of it appearing in a clearing. The mill building, the bunkhouse, the equipment shed, and set back from all of it on a slight rise, the main house. It was a good house. Solid, 2 stories, a porch that wrapped 2 sides. But something about it had the quality of a place that had been left to drift, not neglected exactly, but unattended in the way houses go when the person who'd been paying close attention to them is no longer there. Dutch stopped the wagon near the side entrance. Main house there. Mr. Hale will speak with you in the morning. The sewing room's off the kitchen. She followed him inside. The sewing room was small but functional. Good light from the east window, a solid work table. The machine was a decent make, though it needed oiling and the tension was off. She touched the needle, tested the footplate, salvageable. She could work with this. She set the cherry wood box on the windowsill and looked at it for a moment. We made it, she thought. Not to the box, to herself. To the part of herself she'd kept hidden and intact through all of it. We're here. Then she went to find where the oil for the machine was kept, because there was work to do and she intended to start it. Soren Hale came to find her at 6 the next morning. She'd been awake since 4, had oiled the machine, mended 11 shirts from the stack Dutch had left, 11 shirts that ranged from nearly new with minor tears to items that had been repaired so many times they were more patch than original fabric, which told her something about how long this operation had been running without someone who knew what they were doing. By the time Soren appeared in the doorway, the work table was organized, the window was clear, and she had coffee going on the small stove in the corner because no sewing room worth working in was without one. He was not what she'd expected. She'd built a picture of a timber operation owner, the way you build pictures of people before you meet them. Capable, hard, probably loud. What she got was a man somewhere in his late 30s, who looked like he'd been awake for most of the year on willpower alone. Dark circles. Jaw set in the particular way of someone carrying a load they'd stopped complaining about. He looked at the organized work table, and something moved briefly across his face that she couldn't quite read. You got through the stack, he said. Most of it. I ran out of brown thread and had to work around it. You'll need to resupply, at least 3 spools. The crew goes through it faster than whoever placed the last order accounted for. He looked at her. Dutch handles the supply orders. Then tell Dutch. I'm telling you so, the information gets where it needs to go. She kept her voice matter of fact. This was not an argument. It was information, and he needed it. She watched him register the difference. Soren Hale, he said after a moment. I know, Mr. Alderman told me. He was quiet again, the kind of quiet that meant he was deciding something about her. She let him decide. The terms of the position are straightforward, he said finally. Mending for the crew. Any garment work the house needs. Full use of this room. The bunkhouse is for the crew. He paused. Certain areas of the main house are private. I understand. My nephew. He stopped. This pause had a different texture, softer at the edges and painful. He's 8, he lives here. He's another stop. He seemed to hit the sentence from several angles before choosing the plain version. He doesn't eat with the household. I want you to understand that before you encounter it. Faye kept her expression neutral. What does he eat? Something shifted in his eyes. Most people, she suspected, did not ask the follow-up. Whatever he prepares himself, crackers, hard cheese, simple things. He's been this way for 2 years. Since his mother died, my sister. He said it the way you say things that have been said too many times and have lost their softness through use. He watched her stop eating near the end. After, he just stopped, eating other people's food. He can tell you himself that nothing is wrong with the food. That's not what it's about. He looked toward the window. I've had 3 people quit in the past year because they took it personally. I need you to understand that it isn't. It isn't personal, Faye said. He has no reason to trust a stranger's food yet. The word yet seemed to land in a way she hadn't entirely intended. Soren looked at her for a moment. Then, thank you, he said, in a way that meant more than 2 words generally do. He left. She threaded a new needle and went back to work. She saw the boy, Kit. She learned his name from Dutch, on her 3rd evening. She'd been at the work table past dark, and he appeared in the kitchen doorway, silent, dark-eyed, watching her with an expression that held no hostility and no warmth, just careful observation. She did not look up from the buttonhole she was finishing. After a while, she heard him go back toward the stairs. She reached into her bag and took out the pearl-handled thimble from her mother's sewing box. Her mother's favorite, the one that had been in that box since before Faye was born. She set it on the edge of the work table, in the corner that was visible from the kitchen doorway. Then she went to bed. In the morning, the thimble was in a slightly different position, not gone, just moved. Enough that she knew it had been held. She didn't mention it. 3 days later, a pine cone appeared on the work table, set beside the thimble with a deliberateness that was clearly intentional. The next week, a smooth, flat stone, then a jay feather, so perfectly intact it had to have been kept somewhere before it was offered. She put each of these things on the windowsill above her machine, where she could see them while she worked. The crew came around to her the same way she'd expected, reluctantly, through quality, without anyone acknowledging it was happening. By the end of the second week, shirts that had been structurally failing were lasting through the work. Seams repaired with rough optimism were properly done. A man named Cowboy, 7 years at the operation, the particular quiet dignity of someone who'd learned to ask for very little, brought her his winter coat on a Thursday morning with a split lining he'd been tolerating since last spring. "Think it's worth fixing?" he asked, meaning, "Is it too far gone?" She looked at it. "I can have it done by Saturday." When she handed it back, the lining replaced and the collar reinforced, he held it for a long moment. Then he said, "My wife used to," and stopped. Picked up the coat and left. She didn't ask. People got to keep the end of those sentences. Dutch, she noticed, stopped pretending he wasn't slowing down when he passed the sewing room door. By the end of the third week, he had started filling the wood box for her stove without being asked, which she understood was his version of a significant concession. The blizzard came on a Friday. Wyoming weather had that quality, arriving without explanation, staying as long as it wanted. By the time the road was gone, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. The first day was manageable. The crew had the bunkhouse. Soren worked in his study. Faye held the sewing room and moved into the kitchen at mealtimes because she could cook and the situation required it, and she didn't see a reason to make it complicated. Calloway looked at the stew she sent to the bunkhouse that first evening with the expression of a man who'd been eating his own cooking for too long and wouldn't say so. "It's good," he offered. "There's more," she said. He took more. The second night of the blizzard, Soren came to the kitchen at 9:30 for wood and found her at the table with the sewing box open, working by lantern light on a pattern she'd been meaning to copy out for weeks. He'd come for wood. The particular human need for warmth and company apparently overruled the habit of being alone, because he stayed. He sat at the corner of the table, not across from her but beside, angled toward her work. He looked at the sewing box with the focused attention of someone seeing something for the first time. "That's old," he said. "My mother's." She turned one of the folded patterns in her hands. "She taught me to sew before she taught me to read." She could look at a dress and reproduce it from memory without a single measurement. She set the pattern down. "She died when I was 18. The box is the only thing left of her that's entirely hers. Nothing else ever touched it." He was quiet, then she would have approved of Wyoming. It was a specific thing to say, not "she'd be proud of you," not the comfortable reach for reassuring sentiment. The exact right particular thing. She felt it land somewhere and made herself look at the pattern until the feeling settled. She would have, Faye said. She liked cold weather and she liked trees. The silence between them had the quality of a room that doesn't need filling. She told him about Conrad. Not everything, not yet. Enough that the shape of it was visible, the 3 years, the slow narrowing of who she was allowed to be. The morning she'd looked in the mirror and understood, with the terrible clarity of a thing suddenly seen all at once, that the distance between the woman in the glass and the woman she actually was had been put there deliberately, one careful inch at a time. "What made you leave?" he asked. "I stopped believing him," she said. "That's all. It sounds small, but it took 3 years to get there." He held her gaze with that stillness of his. Then, "Is he looking for you?" "He will be." She folded the pattern. "He doesn't like losing things." Soren nodded once. He took his wood and went back to his study, and she sat in the kitchen with the pattern in her hands and thought about how much cheaper honesty got with practice. How the first time was the hardest, and every time after that was a little less impossible. The nightmare came on the third night. She was at the work table, half asleep on her folded arms, waiting on a hem to dry when she heard it. Not startled awake screaming, the other kind, the kind that starts in the body before it becomes sound. She was on her feet before she'd finished waking. Kit's door was open. He was sitting up in bed, eyes open, and seeing nothing, rigid, making a sound that no 8-year-old should make. Somewhere between sleeping and waking, and the somewhere between was worse than either. Faye crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and took both his hands. Not squeezing, not shaking, just holding with the particular firmness of something real. "Hey," she said quietly, clearly. "Hey, I'm right here. You're in your room. You're in your bed." His whole body was shaking. My name is Faye, she said, the same steady voice. I work in the room downstairs. I've been leaving things on the work table. A pause. You left me a feather. It's a very good feather. I've got it on the windowsill. She kept talking about the sewing room, about the sewing box and the pattern pieces that still smelled like lavender after 6 years, about the pine cone he'd left her and whether she thought it'd come from the east ridge or the lower stand of trees she'd seen from the kitchen window. She talked the way you talk, when talking is the only rope available, and you've learned that the rope works. Kit's breathing began to change, the rigidity eased degree by degree. She was aware of Soren in the doorway. She didn't look up. He's coming back, she said quietly. Give him a minute. She kept talking about the flat gray stone and how she'd been trying to figure out what kind it was, river stone or something that came down off the mountain, about how she'd been meaning to ask him. Kit's eyes focused. He looked at her fully present, fully awake, with an expression she recognized, and the recognition did something swift and irreversible to her chest. It was the look of someone surprised to find they are not alone. There you are, she said. He looked past her at Soren in the doorway. Then he leaned forward slowly and put his forehead against her arm and closed his eyes. She sat very still. Behind her she heard Soren take a breath, slow, the kind that cost something. She shifted slightly to make room. He came in and sat on the other side of the narrow bed and put his hand on Kit's shoulder, carefully, like something he was afraid of breaking. They stayed that way until the boy's breathing slowed into sleep. The letter from Conrad arrived on a Thursday. Faye read it at the work table, folded it, put it in her apron pocket, and went back to the double seam she'd been running. She told Soren that evening. He read it, set it down, read it again. What belongs to me doesn't disappear. He say when he's coming? He doesn't announce himself. He'll come when he thinks the advantage is in the surprise. She met his eyes. I need you to understand who you're dealing with before you decide anything. He works through pressure on other people. He'll find what matters to you and use it. He may go after the timber contracts. He has contacts in the territorial government. He'll use them without hesitation. I know how that kind of pressure works, Soren said quietly. I've been managing it in other directions for 2 years. He looked at her. You're not running. I'm done running. He stood. I'll talk to Dutch tonight. You don't have to do that for me. He stopped in the doorway. He had the expression she'd come to recognize as the one he wore when his mind was completely made up, and he saw no reason to make a speech about it. I know I don't have to, he said. Tell me everything about him, all of it. She told him. All of it. The full shape of 3 years. Not the outline she'd offered during the blizzard, but the real version, the one that still lived in her body and probably always would. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, without looking away. When she finished, he said, Who else has he done this to? It was the right question. The one that meant he'd been paying attention to the structure of what she'd said. I don't know for certain, but there's a pattern in how he operates. That kind of control doesn't come from instinct. It comes from practice. Soren nodded. I have a contact in Cheyenne. He does investigative work for the territorial government. I'm writing to him tonight. She looked at him. You've been thinking about this since the letter arrived. I didn't want to say it until I knew I could follow through. He held her gaze. I don't make promises I can't keep. Conrad came on a Tuesday, 6 days after the letter. 2 men with him. She watched from the sewing room window as they rode into the yard. His easy posture, the deliberate way he occupied space, the habit of a man who'd never once questioned his right to take up as much of a room as he wanted. She went to find Soren. He was already at the front window. They went out together. The cold was sharp and clean. Conrad saw her immediately, and the corners of his mouth moved in the warm way that meant he was already arranging the situation to his advantage. Faye, pleasantly, like bumping into someone at the market. I've been looking for you. I know, she said. He assessed Soren, the brief professional evaluation, obstacle or not. I'm Conrad Price. This is a private matter. I'd like to speak with Faye alone. Whatever needs saying can be said here, Soren said. Conrad's warmth adjusted by a few degrees. He spoke about her with a care so precisely calculated, it took years of living inside it to recognize it as what it was, her difficulties without proper guidance, his ongoing concern. He arranged the words with the facility of a man who'd arranged them before, for different audiences, with different names attached. She let him finish. The collar on your shirt, she said when he was done. Conrad stopped. The seam is pulling on the left side. Whoever finished it didn't know what they were doing. She held his gaze. I made a similar mistake with you. I let you tell me what quality looked like, and I believed you, because you said it with so much certainty. But certainty isn't the same as being right. She kept her voice level and calm. I'm not going with you. There is nothing here that belongs to you. Something went cold behind his eyes. I have meetings with the Territorial Land Office next week, he said, the pleasantness thinning but not gone. There are questions about the Hale timber contracts that I expect will take considerable time to resolve. Dutch alderman appeared at the corner of the equipment shed. Behind him, Calloway. Then two more of the crew, moving with the particular casual arrangement of men who want to be seen without appearing to have been sent. You'd be talking about threatening this operation, Dutch said, in his flattest voice. Want to make sure I heard that correctly. Conrad looked at the assembled men. His associates shifted. She works here, Dutch said. Makes it our concern. Conrad looked at Faye. Something crossed his face she had never seen from him. Not anger, not recalculation, but the specific flatness of a man who has realized mid-hand that his cards are not the ones he thought he was holding. This isn't finished, he said. It finished when I left Denver, Faye said. You've just been slow to accept it. He rode out. She stood in the yard and watched the horses disappear past the tree line and did not let herself feel safe because she knew him. Leaving wasn't the same as giving up. The next move would come from somewhere she hadn't anticipated. But she was not standing in this yard alone. In the arithmetic of the past 3 years, in the long, patient, expensive arithmetic of it, that fact was almost everything. The investigator Soren had written to arrived in November and found 4 women in 2 months, 1 in Pueblo, 1 in Santa Fe, 2 in Denver, both of whom Conrad had maneuvered into settlements under conditions the investigator described with the careful, precise language of a man who'd spent years making coercive things speakable in a courtroom. Faye testified in the spring. It was exactly as hard as she'd known it would be. Conrad's lawyers arranged the true things in the most damaging possible order. They treated her choices as evidence of her own instability. They tried to turn 3 years of someone else's control into 3 years of her own failure. She told the truth, all of it. The other women testified. The one from Santa Fe had been looking for the others for over a year. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. Guilty on the counts that mattered. She walked out of that courthouse into the Wyoming spring with Soren beside her and Dutch 3 steps behind, and she stood on the steps in the clean cold air, pine, mud, the brightness of snowmelt on every surface, and felt not what she'd expected, not triumph, not the dramatic clearing. Something quieter than that. Something more durable. The plain, solid feeling of having done a hard thing all the way through and still being upright on the other side of it. She knew Kit had turned a corner the week before the trial, when she'd come to the sewing room after a long preparation day and found something on the work table. A bowl covered with a cloth, warm. She lifted the cloth. Soup, thin, simple, carefully salted. A piece of bread set beside it, torn roughly but placed with clear intention. He'd made it himself. She could tell by the particular imprecision of it, assembled by someone still learning rather than someone who knew. A child who had not cooked for anyone in 2 years had cooked for her. She heard the second stair creak, Kit, standing just out of sight. She sat down and ate every bit of it. When she looked toward the doorway a few minutes later, he was there, arms at his sides, watching her with those serious dark eyes. It's very good, she said. He didn't say anything, but something in his face released, the held-in quality easing, like a seam that's been drawn too tight, finally finding room to breathe. He came into the kitchen and sat at the table, not halfway in, all the way. She didn't make anything of it. She moved the bread plate closer to his side and went back to her soup. They sat together in the kitchen while the afternoon light moved across the floor, and neither of them needed to speak, and the silence between them belonged to people who had been through something together and found themselves, against considerable odds, on the other side of it. Soren asked her in June, not anywhere dramatic, at the kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday morning, with his coffee going and Kit's breakfast things still at one end. I'm not practiced at this, he said first. She appreciated that. She said yes before he finished, which made the corner of his mouth do the thing she'd come to know. They married on the porch in late summer. Dutch shook Soren's hand hard enough to communicate everything he'd never said in words, then told Faye that the supply records were in good order, the most Dutch-shaped compliment she would ever receive. Calloway cried without embarrassment. Kit stood between her and Soren with the gravity of someone presiding over something important. He had started talking again gradually, in the way things return when they've been gone long enough that the conditions finally become safe. One word, then short sentences, then one morning at the kitchen table a full complicated sentence about the soup he'd made last week and why it had needed more time and how he intended to correct it next time. After the ceremony, when everyone was on the porch with cake and the afternoon stretched long and warm, Kit tugged her sleeve. She bent down. "Can I call you something?" he said. Deliberate, careful, the way he treated things that mattered. She looked at him, his serious face, the question behind it, the full weight of 8 years deciding this was worth asking. "Whatever you want," she said. He thought about it. "I'll think about what," he said, which was so entirely him that she nearly laughed out loud. 3 days later, at breakfast, he called her Faye. Not formally, not with any particular ceremony, just her name in the easy way of someone who'd decided what a word meant and was done deliberating. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the thing she'd carry longer than any of the rest of it. The years at the Hale operation were not simple because no honest life is. Hard winters and good ones, contracts lost and won, a season when the lower road washed out and they rebuilt it themselves in June, one summer when the mill equipment needed replacing and the mathematics were close enough to keep everyone awake. Dutch retired at 62 and came back at 63 because the quiet had gotten to him, which surprised no one. Calloway's daughter came to work in the main house and learned to sew from Faye the way Faye had learned from her mother. At a work table in the early morning, in a room that smelled like machine oil and wood smoke, and the particular specific satisfaction of work done well. Kit grew up and became a cook, which was not surprising to anyone who'd been paying attention. A good one. He moved to Portland at 23 to apprentice in a proper kitchen, sent back recipes and long letters full of opinions, and came home for Christmas every year to argue cheerfully with Dutch about everything that had changed since Dutch's time, which was Dutch's favorite argument to have. The pearl-handled thimble stayed on the windowsill. Faye kept it where she could see it while she worked, through blizzards and legal proceedings and the ordinary ongoing business of a life that had turned out to be more than she'd had any right to expect on the morning she'd walked out of Denver with one bag and a cherry wood box. She'd carried her mother's thimble across half a country, she'd hidden it and kept it intact while everything around her narrowed and narrowed toward nothing. She'd set it on a windowsill in Wyoming, and a grieving child had lifted it, held it, and set it back. That was the beginning of everything worth keeping. Some mornings, when the light came through the east window at exactly the right angle, and the machine was running clean, and Soren was in the yard, and Kit's latest letter was somewhere near the coffee on the kitchen table, she would stop for a moment and look at the thimble on the sill. She thought of her mother. She thought, "I kept it alive, look at what grew." Then she went back to work, because the morning was long and the work was good, and there was always, always more.